Good evening, everyone. I am Arkesh Akolkar, Associate Editor of the Indic Researchers Forum. Today, we will be interviewing Dr. Dheeraj Paramesha Chaya on the topic of India's intelligence culture and the challenges of reforms. Indic Researchers Forum is an independent think tank focusing on advancing India that is Bharat's strategic interests through rigorous research on geopolitics and security studies from a civilizational lens, guided by the principles of civilization, security, and statesmanship. We engage experts and leaders to address Bharat's complex security challenges and fostering a resilient policy which upholds its cultural and strategic identity. Our honorable guest for this interview is Dr. Dheeraj Paramesha Chaya. He's a lecturer in intelligence and international security at the School of Criminology, Sociology, and Policing at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. He has secured his PhD in intelligence studies from the University of Leicester for his studies on the impact of India's intelligence culture on its strategic surprises. He has also authored the book India's Intelligence Culture and Strategic Surprises, Spying for the South Bloc, which is the first academic work on India's foreign intelligence. Besides academic research, Dr. Dheeraj has been imparting training on Indian security forces in the field of intelligence and national security. He is the author of the Intelligence Training Manual of Karnataka State Intelligence. He has also been delivering lectures to the Internal Security Division and the Intelligence Wing of the Karnataka State Police on intelligence and counterintelligence, radicalisation, religious fundamentalism, and counterterrorism. Dr. Dheeraj's research interests lie in the area of strategic intelligence and counterintelligence for national security, sub-state conflicts, radicalization, and de-radicalization. It is an honor to have a luminary scholar for this interview, sir.
Thank you.
So my first question is, sir, in your book, you have written about Kautilyan's intelligence culture and how Rajya Dharma was driving India's statecraft. The post-Kautilyan era has witnessed different cultures in the subcontinent. Do you believe that our agency today are abiding by the Kautilyan intelligence culture? And how do you see the evolution of India's intelligence culture since the Kautilyan era?
Well, when we talk, first of all, thank you, Indic Researchers Forum. I've known you people for quite a long time, and it's an honor to be back on your channel and to be talking with you all. Okay, so coming to the question, when you talk about Kautilyan intelligence culture, right? So when most people pick up Kautilya's Arthashastra and they try to understand what the text talks about intelligence and so on, the primary fascination is around the term spies and espionage. So because if you read the text, the word spies, it keeps on repeating in different various contexts, right? So which is why one gets the impression that this is a state where everybody is spying on everybody else, right? So that is why many scholars tend to consider these kind of texts and these kind of states where everybody is spying on everybody else as counterintelligence states, right? So which is why I recall when I was talking to a British scholar, he he candidly told me that Pakistan is more Kautilyan than India is, because the Pakistani intelligence has a strong covert action culture, it has a strong counterintelligence component and so on, right? But I think that that's a very minimalist way of looking at the Kautilyan intelligence culture, because when we talk about Indian civilization or Indian civilizational texts that guide us through governance, that guide us through the business or profession of intelligence, right? There is an underlying philosophy that one needs to understand, which is exactly what Rajya Dharma is all about, which you alluded to. Then there are purposes. There is a certain purpose to which intelligence serves, and that is something that most scholars tend to ignore. So when you look at the Kautilyan state and you ask what is the purpose that intelligence agencies in the Kautilyan state served, that's where you find the triad, which is it is administration, welfare, and protection. So Palana, Rakshana, and Yogakshema, those are the Sanskrit terms that are used. So you see that intelligence agencies are supposed to function in order to service these three goals of the state. From there, then you have the professional methodologies, right? How intelligence agencies need to operate, how spies need to operate, and who needs to be monitored by the intelligence agencies and so on, right? So there is a deep philosophy which is guiding it. There is a purpose to which intelligence agencies are serving, and then from there flows the methodologies. Now, that is something that has been missing in the, let's say, post colonial independent India's, in the independent Indian state, right? Because what we see is that we are no more, structurally we are not, we are not a monarchy, right? We are a democracy. So democracy works very differently from monarchy. So the whole concept of Raja Dharma itself has to be seen very differently in a modern day context. So when the modern day Indian intelligence agencies came into being, right, they institutionally they were colonial inheritances, but they required a form of guidance from the political class. So if any form of Raja Dharma had to flow, it had to flow from a point of political direction. Now that is something that was missing, right? So as a consequence, what we see is that much of India's intelligence operations are determined by the Indian intelligence managers. Now, there are two key characters who come in India's history. One is Bholanath Malik, who is the longest serving Indian intelligence chief, and is also considered to be the Bhishma Pitamaha of Indian intelligence and so on. So that's the godfather. So he left a very strong mark on how Indian intelligence operates. But there has been change. There has not been any form of continuity, in the sense that some of the ideas that he had brought in have changed over the years. That was followed by another personality named Rameshwar Kao, who is today famous because he was the founder of the RNDW, the Research and Analysis Wing, and also the success of the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War itself has given a sort of fame for this organization and his tenure and so on, right? So these two gentlemen had some Kautilyan characteristics. They had some Kautilyan ideas about what intelligence needs to do, how they need to serve India's national interests, and so on. But from a political perspective, from the political class or the military leadership, from these agencies, from these institutions, we really haven't had the kind of guidance that the Indian intelligence agencies require. So that's the first and fundamental place where the Kautilyan character has been sort of severed, in post-independent India. That then, so protection, but still, as far as the protection Rakshana part is concerned, the Indian intelligence agencies have been doing well. We haven't really lost territory post independence. The territorial integrity has been maintained. We haven't had, for the kind of strategic environment in which India resides, I think that we have managed our security threats quite reasonably, and the intelligence agencies have had a significant role in terms of managing those threats. So the Rakshana part is taken care of, the protection part is taken care of quite well. The problem comes when you look at the welfare part, right? Because that's where you have a lot of scholars talking about Indian intelligence agencies being undemocratic and so on and so forth, right? But because there is no political consensus in India about what intelligence agencies ought to be doing, so there you see that somewhere from a welfare point of view, Indian intelligence is not exactly Kautilyan in that sense. Not only Kautilyan, when we are using the term Kautilyan Arthashastra, but I think that the Indic philosophies or Indic knowledge systems expand much beyond the text of Arthashastra. You could go back to the Shanti Parva, or all of those texts, and they all speak about some dharma component, and that dharma component is missing. And so long as you don't have that, then the necessary reforms won't come about. And for most part, you will see that our intelligence agencies, even whilst they're doing everything possible to make sure that India's national security is protected, you will also have them working for parochial interests, which could be political interests and not necessarily national interests. So there is some form of presence of the Kautilyan architecture or the Kautilyan philosophies in our modern day intelligence, but that is not by design. It's only recently that we've started to, many of the academics have started to study Kautilyan Arthashastra more seriously. They started to ask questions about how we can find relevance from the text and so on. But in terms of actual practice, that's not there. And that also goes on to show, some things like, for instance, if you look at the Arthashastra, it very clearly mentions how to protect a spy. We're not talking about intelligence officers, because there's a very clear demarcation about, there's a very clear structure in place, which means that there is the king, there is the intelligence agencies as institutions, you have the intelligence leaders, you have the station chiefs, and you have the actual, ground level workers, the spies who are, undertaking the risk of, being captured or whatever be the consequences. How do you protect those individuals? What do you do with them? So there are very clear guidelines. So what kind of legal protections they're supposed to have, what does the state owe to them, and so on. But when you think about it, we are roughly about 10, 15 members in this discussion. I don't think any of us can actually name a single spy who actually worked in a foreign country and sacrificed. There are really people who have sacrificed their lives. They've given up everything for the nation, but we really don't know anything about them. We don't know what kind of welfare measures are there to take care of them. So from a lot of these aspects, it is questionable whether India is truly Kautilyan in that in that sense. If we have complete, the point that I'm making is that there are areas, broadly speaking, when it comes to national security, protection, and so on, that we are Kautilyan. But there are several areas where we seem to have lost the Kautilyan spirit or the Indic spirit. So that's the long and short of what I can say without getting into too many details.
Thank you very much, sir, for such an in-depth answer, sir. Sir, in your answer, you had mentioned about the importance of political leadership. So in your book, you had talked about the 3 intelligence failures, discussing the 1962 war, the Kargil war, and 26/11 attacks. You had categorically differentiated between information gap and knowledge gap while assessing an intelligence failure. So can you please elaborate on this? And in the same context, do you feel that there is a major role, as you had elucidated previously, of the political leadership in an intelligence failure or in an intelligence success, sir?
Yeah, thank you again for that question. Just a minor correction. I have not mentioned 26/11 in my book because I've deliberately stopped the book at the end of the millennium because I didn't want to, for whatever reasons, I stopped there. The 3 cases that I looked at were the 1962 war, 71, and 99. So I had made a deliberate effort to compare 2 cases of failures with a case of success, because generally what tends to happen is, it happens to all of us in life. We tend to be more reflective on things when we fail, when we are surprised. But when we succeed, we just take it for granted. We think that we are geniuses and so we won, right? But generally, when you talk about what makes for good intelligence or what makes for a good intelligence performance or a version of strategic surprises, you need to have the ability to compare successes and failures and say why you succeeded in one instance, whereas you failed in others. That's a more intellectual exercise in that sense, right? So what I found was that, yes, indeed, you're right, that there is a difference between information and intelligence. Information gaps will always exist. We are living in the information age, but we are not any smarter than we used to be previously, right? So information has its limitations. And also, when you're living in a competitive space, intelligence agencies are operating in a competitive space, right? So China or Pakistan, for that instance, they want to protect their own information. They don't want you knowing what they're doing, right? So there is always that, there is always the possibility that some bit of information will be held very dear to the decision makers. And also in many instances, the decision makers themselves, I'm talking about the adversarial decision makers, they themselves would not know what decisions they're going to make, right? Until the last moment, it's very difficult to say whether, say, for instance, the 1962 war, right? What did the Indian Intelligence Bureau say? The Indian Intelligence Bureau had been saying since the early 1950s itself that China is going to be adversarial, right? So they knew that from a strategic context, China is not going to be a friend. But will that translate into a war? Now, that's very difficult to say because Mao himself did not decide until 1961, right? So will there be a war with India? One can never say, right? So as far as the strategic environment is concerned, the Indian Intelligence Bureau got it right. They said that the communist China is going to be expansionist. The moment they've got into Tibet, the Himalayas have ceased to exist. The frontiers have now diluted. So we need to be more serious about our, border security and so on. But you had the prime minister who thought otherwise, right? He believed that India and China would be friends and they would lead the world as Asian civilizations and so on and so forth. So you see that dichotomy there, right? So the political leadership is thinking very differently from the intelligence leadership or the intelligence agencies. In fact, that's the reason that, in 1954, when we signed the Panchsheel Agreement, when India signed the Panchsheel Agreement with Mao's China, the Indian Intelligence Bureau was taken by surprise. So the intelligence agency did not know that the prime minister is going to do something like this, right? So this happens. I mean, this is one example that I'm giving, but otherwise it also tends to happen because what really happens at a political level is that politicians are a breed unto themselves. They're here to create history in a certain sense. They are here to leave a mark on history, to say that we did something phenomenal and history has to record that. And so when they interact with global leaders, they see themselves as having access to some kind of information that the intelligence agencies themselves might not have. So the best example I can give you is that of Rajiv Gandhi and Jayawardene in Sri Lanka, right? So after the death of Indira Gandhi, during her funeral, you had Jayawardene who had visited from Sri Lanka, and he cut a conversation with Rajiv Gandhi, and they both spoke to each other. And eventually, you see that the personal relationship between the two led to Rajiv Gandhi, charting a different course for Sri Lanka, which was completely not in sync with what the RNW was saying, right? So many of these political leaders, they see that they have a different source of information, they have a different vision, foreign policy vision or a national security vision that might not be in sync with what the intelligence agencies are saying, right? So when this happens and when you encounter a surprise, is it really intelligence failure? Not necessarily, right? Because it's a failure of your own policy, it's a failure of your own decision. So that's something that we see in 62, we see that in 99 as well, because the RNW had no doubts that just because both of us have, both India and Pakistan have tested nuclear weapons, or because the Indian Prime Minister chose to visit Pakistan by taking a bus or whatever, right? So that really doesn't mean that overnight the country will shed its strategic culture, right? So these kind of things, which are long term, in the sense that how do you recognize your enemy, how do you study him, how do you read him, that is something that intelligence agencies do, but political leaders don't have the incentive, they don't have the time, they don't really do it, because they are here with a very different incentive. So my bigger problem is not actually with the political leadership, because they do it all right, but the problem is with other security agencies, let's say the Indian Army or Indian Defense Forces, right? How do they read the enemies, right? To what extent do they understand the limits of intelligence, limits of strategic intelligence? Because strategic intelligence cannot give you everything. It can give you a broad picture and say that China is turning out to be antagonistic. Xi Jinping does not have good intentions with India. He's having expansionist, tendencies. We have also done something in Kashmir in some places to show that, and we are also building roads on the borders and so on, which could tick off the Chinese, and they could do something with it, right? So you can give that broad understanding of how the strategic environment is shifting. But what happens in a particular theater of operation is something that the commander, on the field, or the Indian Army has to then find out. It's for them to assess, but they can only do it when they understand the enemy well, right? So, and that can happen by two ways, right? And that again feeds into what Kautilya was saying, that you need to have a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, right? So what happens this happens with militaries across the world. I don't say that the Indian military is an exception alone, or the Indian politicians are an exception. So what happens is that they are looking to achieve battlefield successes, right? So they don't really invest too much in intellectualism. So you might see great Indian military leaders, post retirement, talk about things, write about things, and so on. But while in service, the military culture itself is shaped in a manner that they prioritize operations over intellectualism. That is why many scholars talk about professional military education, right? How should the Indian Army, Indian military read the Chinese? I'll give you one example. Going back to the 1962 war itself, right? Just 9 months before the war, you must be aware of this institute called United Services Institute of India, which is in New Delhi. So it is again a military think tank. Just about 9 months before the war, there was a retired Indian military officer. I think his name was Major General Som something, right? So he had written an article about the Chinese way of warfare, right? And he clearly mentioned that the Chinese don't believe in the conventional military theories that we have studied or we people understand. They are completely unorthodox in their approaches. And he had also mentioned this as a consequence of studying what they had done in Korea, right? Yet you see that in 1962, the Chinese repeated what they had done in Korea, and yet we were not prepared for it, right? So it shows that there is something that needs to be done in these security institutions, that they understand the limits of strategic intelligence, while at the same time they develop a certain degree of intellectualism to understand the enemy for what they are, not because what do theories tell you? Theories tell you how the world could operate, how individuals could operate, how nation states could operate, right? But how does a particular nation state with a particular leader, with a particular culture operate in a given situation? That is something you will know only if you study that target for what it is in their own terms, right? Rather than mirror imaging, or rather than imposing your own ideas and thought process on them. So that is something that I think that is lacking in India. So long as you don't develop that kind of professional military education within the military, so long as our politicians don't look beyond short-term political gains and understand the enemies for what they are. It's ideologies can have the place. You can have a constituency in India which will vote for you if you say Pakistan is our enemy, or which will vote for you if you say Aman ki Asha, right? But that's besides the point. You need to work with hard facts. You need to understand what Pakistan's strategic culture is, what China's strategic culture is, and then you got to move forward. And we did that very briefly during the 70s and 80s, especially under Indira Gandhi. That's how you saw the Indian intelligence organization spread its wings to far-fetched places across the world, because we had a vision. Especially when you look at the Indian Ocean region, we were quite clear that the Indian Ocean region is our region. We will not let any other power get into it. But then it stopped there, because when you look at the state of the Indian Navy, when you look at our power projection in the region and so on, we could have done a lot more. But it's somewhere, that strategic vision was lacking. So I wouldn't. So I think that the one-stop solution that I can think of at this point, which is something that most people within the system will not agree, is to come out with a national security strategy, and it has to be made public. Because you can't. Right now, we have one, is what people say, and that is something. It's a secret document. My question is, what happens once you people are out of power? Because the moment the next government comes in, nobody. So I'll give you an example. I work with the Karnataka State Police, right? So I worked with them since 2022, and there was a change of government in between, and none of the officers who we trained initially were in the same positions. They had all been moved around, rotated around to different, to other areas, right? So what happens then? So if there's a change of government, will they follow your national security strategy, or will it be just shelved somewhere and nobody's going to work on it? So we need a bipartisan consensus. You need something to be put out in the public so that the public knows, and the public can hold your elected representatives accountable to what happens. Because to this day, we don't know what is the governmental thinking. I don't mean the present day government. Across all governments that have come so far, we don't know what was their thinking about China. We just know that 1993 there was an agreement signed, and then there was peace building, and all of a sudden you're surprised now. Right, so now we can look back and say that it was a grand deception that the Chinese played out and so on. But what exactly was our thinking about them, right? Because many are surprised. There's a scholar by name Michael Handel. If you read his work, he clearly tells you that surprises are not only about what your enemy is doing, right? It's also about what you're doing in comparison to what he is doing, right? So your own actions are equally responsible for you to be surprised, and it's not just the enemy's actions. So it's quite a complex and complicated thing, but I think that somewhere the start has to happen. And if that has to happen, it has to begin with some form of articulation of what our national security goals are. It can't be simply a simplistic understanding that Pakistan is an enemy, China is an adversary. No, but in what ways do you think that these adversarial entities are going to operate? We understand that, for example, if you take cyber as the space, we understand that China poses a threat, Pakistan poses a threat in the cyberspace, and so do Western countries. Let's not leave them out of the equation. So all of them pose a threat, but in what ways? Who do you think are the likely targets? Is it electoral interference? What is it? So most of these questions are not easily answerable. Many people have their own opinions of it, but there is no consensus around it. So long as you don't build that, then failures tend to keep happening again and again. So I'll stop it here. That is a long rant, I guess.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, I'm very sorry for mentioning 2611. I'm very sorry for the slip of tongue.
That's okay.
So you had talked about the importance of national security strategy. Sir, do you feel at the same time, along with the national security strategy, there is a requirement for an overhauling of the Indian intelligence-related legislations to the likes of done in United Kingdom and United States of America, or something like a church committee, which happened in the United States of America as well, to ensure there is an operational clarity on the powers of the intelligence agencies, along with what is their mandate, and what is their limitations as well?
Well, I wouldn't say that I have a very strong conviction or an established position on this, because I think my own ideas are still developing on this, and much of what I say might not be to the liking of many people. But you see, when I look at the US or the United Kingdom, they have their own share of failures, and they're much worse than India's. Trust me, their failures are, I don't think that India could ever fail in that sense. Indian intelligence could ever fail in that sense. So purely from an experiential basis, I see that we have been doing reasonably well. at least as far as our core areas are concerned. So I think that these questions of whether there should be a legislation, whether there should be legal backing, and so on. Again, I would refer you to a scholar named Matthew Croston, who's written this quite well, and he says that if you look at India's strategic environment, if you look at the kind of threats that India faces, most other countries don't face that kind of those kind of threats, or they don't inhabit such a precarious strategic environment, right? So it's easy for them to sit in such places and then pontificate and say, we are like this and this is how you have to be, right? And that is why you also see the Chinese tell the Americans that, you have your own ways of doing intelligence. We have our own ways of doing intelligence. Because if you practically come to think about it, what are the Americans complaining about China? That China is stealing intellectual property, right? It might be a matter of principle that the Americans are not stealing intellectual property anywhere, but it could also be that there is no, there's not that kind of intellectual property anywhere else for the Americans to steal, because they're much ahead of everybody else in most fields, right? So it could also be that it's a matter of convenience that they've built rules around these things where it wouldn't apply to them. So when they say such things to India, right, about Indian intelligence and so on, I would be a bit skeptical about those kind of suggestions. So for me, when Indians suggest that we need to have a legislation or anything like that, my question is, for what purpose? I mean, any suggestion has to be backed by a purpose. So if your purpose is good, so for me, many a times what I hear is that it will help improve intelligence performances. That is something that I haven't found convincing at all. Convincing it that simply because you have a system of accountability or so on, because I mean parliamentary accountability, because I don't see many of our politicians really being that security conscious or intelligence conscious that they understand much of the things, right? But that said, if it's a question of misuse of resources and so on. Yes, to that extent, yes, I do agree that there has to be some form of accountability so that you don't see intelligence agencies misuse resources and so on. But I think that when I look at some of the archival documents from the past, there has been some form of checks and balances, if not accountability. For example, I was looking at I recently wrote an article on the development of communications intelligence capabilities in India, just before 1962 war and after the 1962 war until the creation of the RNDW. And that is a period where, I mentioned Bolanath Malik, right? B.N. Malik, who was the doyen of Indian intelligence. He was someone who was considered to be extremely close to Prime Minister Nehru. So, and he also had a reputation that, if you wanted to have a career in the national security bureaucracies in India, you didn't want to cross him, right? So he was that powerful a man. But what the archives tell me is that it is not that easy to procure anything that they wanted. Funds were not coming easily. Intelligence agencies simply could not have their way. Even secrecy, for that instance, I recall in terms of procurement of some kind of equipment, the intelligence bureau had said that this is all secret information, we can't say. And the Minister of Home Affairs, the bureaucrat sitting there, the IAS officer sitting there, he had replied that many of these things are just open knowledge. I could get an expert from the open market and he could tell me all these things. So there's nothing secret about what you guys are saying. Only thing that needs to be secret is where you're positioning these, in what numbers. Those could be secret, but the technical aspects are not really secret, right? I mean, anybody could get that. So all these kinds of back and forth discussions and all that, it tells me that things are not that easy. They're not as black and white as people make it out to be. There have been checks and balances within the system, but it's just that the public are not aware of it, and the public need to know. At least we need to have some form of declassification policies about what has happened and so on. Again, Indian intelligence officers, many of them would disagree with me. I mean, I find it quite surprising, because I could write a book on Indian intelligence from sitting in UK, right? Because even if you don't declassify documents, you have the Americans and the British who have declassified the documents, which clearly give out what you guys have done, right? So I think that those are things, right? So when you're talking about legislations and so on, it is just not about giving a charter to a watertight charter to the intelligence agencies, which could, in a sense, backfire. I think that a bit of overlapping is fine. It doesn't do much of a damage. But I think that we need to be thinking more holistically about accountability, declassification, and it's about and also educating the consumers of intelligence about how to use these agencies, right? So you had, so for example, going back to the whole idea of misuse of intelligence, right? you have successive governments. One government, I mean, I can take you back to Malik Sira as well, right? So what happened, what really went wrong post-colonial, post the colonial period, is that you had the Indian intelligence leadership initially believe that they're working for the Indian state, right? But soon they realized that they're not working for the Indian state, they're working for the party in power. Now, why do I say this? Because if you look at that period, right, who were the targets of the Indian intelligence? They were the communists, right, because of ideological threats. They were the Islamists because, Pakistan had been created, they were clearly a threat. But there were also people of certain ideological persuasion within the Congress party. So so they were above, over and above all these politics and so on, and they saw that anybody who's a national security threat needs to be monitored, right? But gradually you will see, at least from the time of the emergency and so on, that their survival is directly linked to how loyal they are to the political party. And so that's when you start to see all these phone tapping of political opponents of people and so on. And that continues till about the mid 90s, when you have these third front governments that come to power. And that is a time when people had really high hopes, at least the ones who were democratic in their thought process, they had high hopes that these third front governments, which were always at the receiving end of the state's wrath, so they would do something about this. But eventually they too felt that now that we are in power, we can misuse this rather than rectify this, right? So it is the political class, so the change has to come from there. I think that this, the sense of consciousness, security consciousness, or privacy consciousness and so on, is absent in the Indian public. So I think that accountability and so on, or all of that, will come from a grassroots level education. So you see, it's not a one thing, it's like a holistic thing. One thing connects to another and so on, right? So you need to make changes across the board. Only then will you see Indian intelligence agencies actually functioning for the sake of India's national security alone, and not any parochial interest. Beyond that, just simply giving them a legislative mandate and all that, you can always overcome them here. It's not something that will tie them down. They will easily work around all of those things, because it's happening in the Western countries as well. It's not something that simply because they have legal backing or legislations, they are over and above all sorts of misuse. That's not really the case.
Thank you for shedding a light on this, sir. It has been a point of debate across for a long time now. Thank you for sharing your opinion on this, sir. Sir, in your previous answer as well, you had mentioned about the importance of knowing the opposition, about the target country's culture and the history which a country has. Along with, sir, you had also talked about understanding India's intelligence culture and what is the background of India. And you had also elucidated about the Asian values and the difference of cultures which country have. Sir, on that note, sir, with the recent events. So we have seen the Five Eyes group being an Anglosphere intelligence alliance. They have stood together with each other. They have stood by each other during the Khalistan issue, and same has been the case with the Islamic civilization, especially against Israel in the current scene, to a larger extent. So, do you believe that cultures and civilizations play a role in the espionage world? And what are the challenges and opportunities for a civilizational state such as India?
Okay. Again, I've received a lot of flack from some people here in in the UK and other places for using those terms, civilization and so on. You see, it's a combination of both those things. One, yes, your identities matter. Who you are will eventually matter, but interests also matter. Interests keep changing, and so that will also matter. So when you look at this historically, why did the United States or the British intelligence prefer Pakistan over India? You will notice that, one, their geographical position, but also there was an ideological component to it, because they felt that Pakistan, being an Islamic state, could provide the necessary inroads into the Middle East and so on, right? So that cultural component was always there. And you see that to this day, when a country like India or South Korea or Japan or any of these countries do not get access to the Five Eyes Club. So it's easy to make these cultural or civilizational kind of arguments. But we also need to see how have we negotiated them, and that's where I think that the value of interest and the material aspect can never be overcome entirely. Because think about how India has interacted with the Western intelligence agencies, right? Overtly, we've always had a sort of hostile relationship with the Americans, at least during the Cold War, right? From the 70s onward, early 70s, there was a brief period between the 1962 war and the coming of Indira Gandhi in 67-68. So until then, we had that honeymoon period with the American and British intelligence. But before and after that, we've not really had a great bilateral relationship between these countries. But the intelligence agencies have always been good to each other, right? So despite the fact that they civilizationally we are not the same, but culturally we are supposed to be we are supposed to be similar in one sense because we are both democracies, but still we are not considered the best of friends. And it's not just that the Americans have always been taking us to right. I recently got to read a document from the United States, which said that the Indians are not sharing intelligence with us, and they speculated that it could be for two reasons: either that they don't want to share intelligence with us, or that they're just doing such a bad job that they don't want us to know what kind of, how bad a job that they're doing. But and I think that the reason was the former, because we were doing a reasonably good job at that point in time, except for China. When it comes to Pakistan and India's internal security, we were doing a fairly good job, and we were well informed. So it is quite clear that India has been negotiating from the time of the first Indian intelligence chief itself, that we have an understanding that we cannot entirely trust anybody in that sense. So what we've done is we've been diversifying our partnerships. The mistrust of the Americans has always been high. So over the years, we have developed friendship with other countries such as France, it could be Israel, and so on. And whenever an occasion has occurred, for example, post the moment the global war on terror was launched, it was quite clear that the Pakistanis are going to be their friends again. But sooner or later, by the time of 2011, 2008, when the 26/11 attack happened in India, it was quite clear to the Americans and the so-called neutral Western European countries, be it Switzerland, Netherlands, and all these countries, were not really too invested in what is happening in the South Asian sphere. So they all realized that Pakistan is not trustworthy, so we need to build greater relationships with India, with Indian intelligence, and so on. So we did not gain access to the Five Eyes grouping, but India was made part of another exclusive club, signals intelligence club, called the US SIGINT Pacific, where raw data was shared with India and so on. So the point being that these countries, despite the fact that they are culturally homogeneous, they tend to share some sort of civilizational linkages with each other, the five English-speaking countries and so on, they are not completely free from material impulses. So when they see that there is an advantage in partnering with you, they will partner with you. And that is something that Indians also need to be aware of, right? So, but what happens is, it's okay. I mean, people might disagree with me on this as well, but I think that we have a tendency of firing before we are ready, if I may put it that way, because I've been seeing this since the 1950s, from the time of this kind of speeches that Krishna Menon used to give, or to the present day, where our foreign minister, he's so vocal and he's brilliant when it comes to so-called giving back to the Westerners and so on. Sometimes that comes with its own risks, so it's like Deng Xiaoping had said that bide your time, hide your strengths, so as long as you're not ready yet, cover up your strengths, maintain a low profile. I think that is somewhere harming, because this is something that I got from because of all the recent events that have also been happening between India, Canada, India, US, and so on. The many people within the Western world, they think that Indians are getting too assertive, right? Whether it is right or wrong is a subjective thing. But I believe that for a civilization state which has no friends, you really have no friends, sometimes you will need to give it back. Sometimes you will need to stand up strong and tell it to the world that we are independent, we do what we have to do. But at some instances it will have to be tempered down. You'll have to just maintain a low profile until and unless you acquire the kind of strength. So once you have acquired that kind of strength, then you will have to then decide where do you want to project that strength, right? So yes, civilizationally, India does not have friends. India cannot expect to have a free pass anywhere. But we are fortunate to have a massive territory, massive population. How do you harness this population? How do you harness this territorial size that you've got? You have an ocean named after you. You can have control over the sea lanes and so on. So with all of that, those are the kind of capabilities that you need to develop so that you can have a negotiating power with different civilizations or different people. So think about India's relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's a classic example, right? There was a time when political Islam was guiding the Saudi foreign policy, and India was not seen as a viable destination in comparison to Pakistan. But you see, today, when the Saudis realize that there is more to gain by making friendships with India over Pakistan, so they've realized that okay, Kashmir issue can be there, but we see sense in building closer relationships with India, right? So similarly, even in the intelligence world, it's a question of aggregated strength, adaptive realism, as in what do you have to offer, so if you can tell the world that this space is mine and I'm more informed than anybody else in this space, then the world will come to you, right? And so there are many ways of managing this problem of not having civilizational friends and so on. So it's not a dead end. It is a serious challenge, but it is something that can be worked around if at all we have the kind of pragmatism to work around it. And I think we have, when you look at our friendships with other countries, Japan and so on. So that is something, and it's more pronounced in the intelligence field. And also, fortunately, we've had very good intelligence managers who've been able to develop certain interpersonal relationships. If I can give an example from the 1980s, because there's this whole thing about the CIA interference in India and so on, in Punjab and all that. There's not much evidence to it, because we knew that the Pakistanis were doing something directly in Punjab, but there's no real evidence of Americans doing something directly in Punjab, indirectly through the diaspora. It's a different deal. So at that point in time, you had George H.W. Bush, the senior Bush, have a conversation with Mr. Kao, who was the national security advisor at that point in time. And, you see that these gentlemen having a very different kind of conversation that is not reflected at the political level. At the political level, you have, the worst kind of words being slung at each other. But at the intelligence managers level, they are managing the relationship much better, because they understand there is this requirement for both countries to share intelligence with each other to, for all those purposes, right? So at a managerial level and also at the grand strategic level, if you have a degree of pragmatism, I think that this problem can be handled, and we have been doing it.
Thank you, sir, for shedding such a light and providing us a historic context as well. Sir, you had talked about the important role which is played by the intelligence managers. Sir, as per the Parliamentary Standing Committee, 60%, nearly 60% of the cadre of intelligence agencies and enforcement agencies even is deputation based. Sir, could you give some recommendations on the topic of intelligence reforms to meet the challenges of 21st century in general, especially when it comes to recruitment and structures?
Look, as we speak, I am working on a project which is the intellectual biography of Mr. Malik, who I said was the longest-serving Indian intelligence chief, right? You see, Malik had very different ideas from R.N. Kao, and these are the only two individuals who left a very strong mark while they were in service, because the moment they left service, things changed, right? So what Malik did was to create. I mean, people tend to say that the Indian intelligence is mostly police dominant, and then they trace it back to Malik. But Malik had very different ideas. So the kind of people he chose were the top-ranked officers from the IPS. And mind you, this is a time when very few people could clear UPSC. We were not a highly literate society at that point in time, right? So he picked up the most well-educated and smart people, and then he converted them into career intelligence officers. They did not have an option of going back. Right, so that was one way of creating, and in fact, it was called the EMS system, earmarking system. And your current national security advisor was also one of those EMS officers, right? But that entire system died out when Indira Gandhi came to power, because the IPS lobby did not like that the best of the cadres are going there and they are creating their own sphere there. So they completely put an end to EMS, right? So there, that experiment failed. Then you had R.N. Kao come in, and he wanted to create a very different kind of an agency, where he did not go the Malik way, but he sought to draw talent from the open market and then create something known as the RAS, where you had, again, career intelligence officers who would spend their entire time in that service. But that also failed eventually because of some certain malpractices and certain bureaucratic jealousies and so on. Today, the systems have changed, environment has changed, because you have a lot of talent in the open market, right? But it's not just talent, it is the lure of a job also in the open market. Now many people, I mean, yes, in the Indian bureaucrats are quite well paid. They're quite in comparison to many other countries, or in comparison to most of the jobs in India, if you take into consideration the perks, the salaries, and so on, they are quite they're in a safe position, if I can put it that way, right? So it is still possible for the governments to tap into the right talent, but how do you do it? I think that going through the UPSC route is quite problematic now, because gone are the days, you're living in the information age. So just because you can recollect some facts and figures and so on, I don't know, I mean, and then you go through the training for to be an administrative service officer or revenue service officer, postal service or something, and then you want to become an intelligence officer. It doesn't work that way. And like as you mentioned, deputation is a serious problem. So going forward, what do we do? That is a question I think that we need to be discussing and debating, because do we think of creating a permanent cadre of intelligence officers or intelligence analysts and so on, or do we think of partnering with private intelligence firm or private firms, be it academic world or anything, because if you take a look at the United States, you have something like the Rand Corporation, where they get some form of secret information, and then they develop the kind of analysis they can, research they can, and they do, and so on. In India, there is this perception that the civil servants know it best, and I think that these perceptual things have to change. So whenever people ask me about intelligence reforms, or any changes that need to happen with the Indian intelligence agencies, I think that it is a systemic level change that has to happen, at a bureaucratic level, at a cultural level, and so on. And you will see those downstream effects in the Indian intelligence agencies. Otherwise, what happens? You might have a strong leader like a Malik or Aran Kao, who come in with revolutionary ideas and they execute it very well, but it will not stand the test of time. Because the underlying fundamental qualities haven't changed, the cultural attributes have not changed, right? So long as those don't change, as long as they don't change, right, you will tend to see these problems continue. You will definitely tend to see these problems continue. So the moment the EMS ended in the 70s, you suddenly saw that most of the deputationist, IPS officers who came to the Intelligence Bureau were mostly coming from the Northeast cadres, because they wanted to escape the difficulties from those regions, right? So the incentives will be very different. And even now, the kind of people who come on deputation are coming for a whole bunch of reasons, right? And they're not necessarily they haven't got anything to do with intelligence at all. Their motivations are very different. So I think that although if you need all these things to change, you need to have a clear idea of where you want to be in terms of your national security goals, what kind of institutions are required in order to achieve this, and then how do you then shape your institutions in order to achieve this. So far what we've been doing is that we have been only picking up on certain Western changes, Western reforms, and then bringing them here. Have they been working well in the Indian system or not is anybody's guess. We have the National Security Council Secretariat. It was in existence even during the Kargil War, but it didn't seem to have any significant influence over the policies that were made at that point in time. And in terms of manpower, again, so what Malik did post the 1962 war around that point in time was he picked up people, he picked up officers, and he told them that you are going to be permanently focusing on this particular country in this particular region or whatever it is, right? So when the RNDW was created, they were fortunate to inherit those officers, right? For example, there was a former chief of RNDW by his name was N. Narasimhan, so he was a career China expert. Mr. Jayadev Ranade, who you would have seen, his analysis there on the internet today. And so he was also a career intelligence officer who focused only on China, but so if you're a deputationist and so on, do you have that luxury to develop that kind of experience, right? So, and for all of this to happen, again, I'll tie it back to the previous point that I was making. Every intelligence officer that walks into the profession in India, he or she has to have some avenues of learning the agency's history, its operations, what kind of lessons were learned and whatnot. How do you do it if there is no studies being conducted on Indian intelligence, if nobody's writing about it, if everything is hidden behind the walls? And because nobody, if you're coming to an organization for a year or two, why would you bother looking at the shelves and looking at old documents and so on, right? So how do you overcome these things? So one, you start to declassify, start to embrace, academics, give them an opportunity to write about these things, so that if there are two or three books, or let's say a handful of books that come on a particular region from an intelligence point of view, it is a valuable source for every intelligence officer who's coming in, be it on deputation or whatever, for them to quickly brush up on those things. So that's one way, right? Second, like I said, you need to have a clear idea about where you want to be in terms of your national security goals. So if today we're moving into a world where you are saying that cyber threats are going to be seriously, it's going to have a serious impact on our national security, and we want to develop this kind of manpower, is UPSC an ideal platform then to recruit people with the requisite skills? Because if kids between the age group of 13 and 18, teenagers are just using computers, and they're doing things that you and I could not dream of, then why would somebody go through the drill of getting into a clearing the UPSC exams, and then going through a year of training in, say, in police services, whatever services, and then expect to have a career in let's say cyber or anything, right? So we need to have the discussion about what areas we can open it up to the public and have open source collaborations with private firms and so on, and what part of national security needs to be held secretive and held within the purview of state intelligence agencies. And then if this is to be held within the purview of the state intelligence agencies, how do we develop those institutions, right? It really cannot work this way, that you have you're inspired by leaders, and once those leaders vacate the seat, you're again in a state of confusion. So that cannot continue. So I think that I see more problems than solution in this. So unfortunately, answering your questions, I think I've thrown open a lot more, questions than answers. But I'm sorry, that's how it is.
Nonetheless, thank you very much, sir, for propounding and giving us more food for thought and something that everyone must think about for the future of the Republic. Sir, thank you very much for providing us a deep insight into the depths, intricacies, history of the real life functioning of the Indian intelligence apparatus, the challenges which they face, and the future ahead, and along with the way ahead. It was a delight to have you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you, and I hope that I haven't confused you all more than you were, because I tend to have a habit of doing that. But anyways, it was great discussing with you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
It was an honor, sir, from my side. I'm very